A patriarch tightens his grip on a ledger's edge as distant cannon fire shakes the floorboards. Powder dust drifts from the rafters like falling snow. Outside, workers pause, knowing one misstep could turn the riverbank to fire. In moments like this, a family does not gain power, it survives it. And the dynasty that follows will turn danger into fortune, and fortune into something far darker, as history tilts open. Subscribe to Empire Unknown, where history breathes again. The river moved like a long, dark vein through the forest, its surface trembling beneath the wind. At dawn, mist drifted low over the Brandywine, soft as worn linen, hiding the scars carved by men who had come here chasing survival. Before the machines groaned awake, before boots touched the ground, there was only the river's steady breath. But beneath that quiet, something volatile waited, something powdered, pressed, and hungry. Etienne Dupont stepped into that mist as if stepping back into memory.
He carried the scent of exile with him, smoke from the French Revolution, echoing gunshots in Paris streets, the weight of failed ideals clinging to his coat. He had fled across an ocean, not seeking glory but refuge. Yet fate rarely lets a man outrun the craft he knows too well. His family had once made powder for kings. Now, in this new world, he would make it for a nation still learning how to walk. The early mills rose from the riverbank like wooden bones, narrow and fragile, each one spaced far apart as though their builders feared they might argue. Inside them, explosive dust rested in barrels, trembling at the slightest vibration. Etienne understood the danger intimately, the way static could spark a fire, the way a single careless breath could end a life. Perhaps that is why he treated each building like a living creature that must be respected, not controlled. Workers arrived in slow procession, their silhouettes pale in the morning haze. They moved with the solemnity of soldiers entering a battlefield they had survived too many times. Some carried scars on their hands, others carried stories of mills they'd seen vanish in thunderous bursts. Their wages were good, better than most laborers could dream, but a powder mill paid its men not just in coin, but in risk measured by the heartbeat. Etienne's voice carried calm authority as he inspected their work. He corrected technique with gentle precision, a craftsman rather than a tyrant. The men respected him, not because he held their fates, but because he shared their danger. He walked into the mills first. He inhaled the same sharp, metallic air. He touched the same barrels. Leadership here was not proclaimed. It was lived. As the wheels turned and the river-powered hammers struck, the mills began to breathe. Gunpowder, black, granular, and deadly, took shape through grinding and refining, each motion measured like a ritual. The scent of sulfur hung thick, mixing with damp wood and cold river spray. When Etienne brushed his fingers across the powder, it clung like dark snow. He studied it with an almost fatherly scrutiny, looking for flaws that could mean catastrophe. This was the rise, quiet, deliberate, built not from conquest but craftsmanship. Yet, even in these earliest moments, the river whispered warnings. Wooden beams groaned under the strain. Dust floated in the air like drifting ash. And in the pause between hammer strikes, a man could hear his own mortality humming back at him. Workers joked softly to keep fear at bay. They said the mills were like temperamental beasts. Feed them well and they obeyed, neglect them and they devoured. But Etienne heard something else in that comparison: possibility. For in every dangerous venture, there is a moment when dread becomes ambition, and ambition, when sharpened, becomes empire. Through the seasons, the Brandywine works grew. New mills rose in cautious clusters, more hands arrived, and with each shipment of powder sent to hunters, militias, and armies, the DuPont name glimmered a little brighter, never loudly, never boastfully,
but with the steady glow of a forge that knows exactly what it is making. Yet the fracture came quietly, the way all fractures do. Powder mills are patient predators. They wait for a loose nail, a spark from a coat button, a moment of distraction. Some days the air felt heavier, as if warning that the mills had grown restless. Etienne walked through the buildings with practiced calm, but even he could sense tension hiding beneath the floorboards. It happened in late afternoon. A single building, one that had stood without complaint for years, erupted in a blaze so bright it erased the sun. The ground shook. A shockwave tore through the valley like a roar released from underground. Workers dropped to their knees, chests heaving, ears ringing. And when the smoke cleared, there was nothing where the mill had stood, only splintered wood scattered like bones, and the unmistakable silence of sudden death. Men whispered the names of those lost. They spoke them as if reciting ancient prayers, each one marked by soot and grief. Etienne stood at the edge of the ruin, his face carved by ash and disbelief. He had known this danger intimately. He had built his world around taming it. But in that moment, standing before the remains of his own ambition, he saw the truth every empire eventually faces. Power does not come without sacrifice. Sometimes it demands payment in fire. Yet even as grief coiled around the workers, another force took hold: resolve. Men volunteered to rebuild, hands trembling but determined. Widows insisted their husbands' work not die with them, and Etienne, carrying both sorrow and stubborn hope, began to draw new plans: safer mills, better spacing, taller blast walls, structures that bent danger rather than challenged it. This was the echo, the moment loss reshaped destiny. The DuPont empire did not rise from wealth. It rose from discipline, precision, and a terrifying intimacy with danger. Every building was rebuilt stronger, every worker trained deeper, every barrel inspected with almost holy reverence. It was as if the family understood that to master powder, they must also master fear. And as the sun set on the Brandywine, casting long shadows across the mills that survived, Etienne watched the river drag shards of wood downstream. He wondered how many empires had begun this way, not in triumph, but in the aftermath of disaster. Not in glory, but in the decision to continue. Night settled. Lanterns glowed along the riverbank, flickering in the wind like fragile flames refusing to die. The workers dispersed in weary silence, boots sinking into damp soil. Etienne remained, alone with the mills, listening to the creak of timbers and the restless churn of the water. The name he had carried from France had begun to root itself in American soil, fed by danger, shaped by tragedy, warmed by ambition. And somewhere in the darkness, the first spark of a dynasty glowed, faint, fragile, but undeniable, a quiet fire waiting to ignite. The manor rose above the Brandywine like a declaration, stone walls set against the wilderness, chimneys exhaling quiet confidence, windows reflecting not just light but lineage. It was not a palace by European standards, not yet, but it carried the first breaths of something larger, the beginning of an American aristocracy forged not from land or old titles, but from the chemistry of danger. Inside those walls, the air felt different. There was the scent of polished wood, imported books, and the faint trace of charcoal from Etienne's laboratory. This was a home built on knowledge, the kind that could either illuminate the world or set it ablaze. And every corner whispered the same truth. This family was no longer merely surviving exile. They were shaping their destiny, grain by grain, formula by formula. Etienne moved through the halls with the careful grace of a man balancing two worlds: the scientist who trusted numbers more than men, and the noble who understood that power also lived in alliances woven through conversation and ceremony. His children watched him closely. They saw the precision in his hands as he measured components in the lab, and the command in his posture when guests arrived at the manor.
To them, he was not simply a father, he was the architect of a new name. Even the quiet moments thrummed with ambition. At dinner, the family spoke of production ratios and explosion risks as easily as others discussed weather. Strategies unfolded between spoonfuls of stew, which suppliers could be trusted, which militia contracts were worth pursuing, which neighboring families held influence that might someday matter. The table was not a place of rest, it was a council chamber disguised in domestic warmth. But the true heart of the manor was the library. Shelves bowed under the weight of chemical texts, political histories, and notebooks filled with Etienne's tight, deliberate handwriting. Here, under the glow of oil lamps, he taught his sons and daughters the alchemy that guided their world. Not just the transformation of raw materials into powder, but the transformation of uncertainty into structure, chaos into opportunity. Science, he often murmured to them, is the cleanest form of power, and power, once gained, must be guarded in silence. From these lessons grew the early threads of a dynasty. Marriages were not merely romantic possibilities, they were calculations. A union with a merchant family strengthened supply lines. A bond with a landowner provided protection and influence. Each wedding sewn into the family tapestry expanded the DuPont reach across the young nation. The sons married women whose families held property, ships, or political ties. The daughters entered households that brought prestige or commercial access. Every vow spoken beneath candlelight carried the subtle weight of negotiation. Letters traveled across states with coded diplomacy. Invitations to dinners served as quiet tests of loyalty. And within the manor's study, Etienne charted these connections with the meticulousness of a chemist recording measurements, proof that the family's future would not rely on chance. Yet beneath all this refinement, the floorboards remembered the mills. Danger lived like a ghost in the rafters. Powder dust clung to boots and coats, carried uninvited into the manor. The family spoke softly of risk, avoiding the names of men lost in the blasts. To speak too much was to acknowledge the fragility beneath their success. Still, every dynasty has its fractures. It began with disagreements too small to notice at first, the tension between those who valued the science and those who valued the prestige. Gusts of pride drifted into decisions. Some believed the family should lean deeper into industry, expanding the mills, pushing productivity. Others saw the growing wealth as a chance to ascend socially, to step into the sphere of American elites who knew nothing of powder burns or riverside explosions. Etienne sensed the shift, but kept his silence. He had built the foundation, now the next generation would test its strength. One evening, during a gathering of local elites, the manor felt charged. Candlelight flickered across polished silver. Violin strings wove through the air. Powdered wigs and tailored coats mingled in genteel order. But in the corner of the room, Etienne watched his sons speak with an enthusiasm that felt foreign. They boasted of profits, of expansion, of the mills running at unprecedented capacity. Their confidence carried the sharp edge of pride, the kind that forgets the danger beneath its own feet. A passing draft rattled a chandelier chain, and Etienne's gaze lifted toward the ceiling. For a heartbeat, he heard the rivers roar instead of music. He smelled sulfur instead of wine. And in that moment, he understood the truth that would shape the family long after he was gone. The greater the rise, the deeper the cracks that form beneath it. Still, ambition pushed forward. The DuPonts traveled to Philadelphia, to Washington, to social circles that measured worth not by work, but by influence. Their polished manners, foreign charm, and growing fortune intrigued politicians and industrialists alike. Invitations multiplied, doors opened. And with each handshake, the family's identity reshaped itself. No longer refugees, no longer artisans, but something approaching nobility in a nation that claimed not to have any. Yet inside the manor at night, when the guests were gone and the candles guttered low, Etienne walked the halls with the weight of memory. He remembered Paris burning. He remembered friends lost to revolutions and riots. He remembered a truth carved into history. Wealth can be earned, but dynasties are fragile things, always one fracture away from collapse. In the quiet, he sometimes heard faint echoes from the mills, the rhythmic thump of hammers, the whisper of powder shifting in barrels. Those sounds reminded him that their empire rested not on marble, but on explosive dust. And dust, no matter how expertly refined, is always waiting for a spark. As the years passed, the children grew into heirs. Their ambitions sharpened like the steel tools on Etienne's workbenches. Their confidence rose with the manor walls. Their alliances widened the family's influence. And in the shadows of all they built, the fracture lines deepened, unseen, unspoken, but inevitable. For every dynasty built on science and silence must someday face the instability of both. And somewhere beneath the polished floors of the manor, the first tremor of that future shift stirred, faint, distant, like a warning tapping from underground, a sound only time itself could hear. War did not arrive at the Brandywine with soldiers or banners. It arrived as a distant vibration, a tremor crawling beneath the soil, crossing states, cities, and rivers until it reached the DuPont mills like a warning carried in the bones of the earth. When the first cannon thundered at Fort Sumter, the boom echoed into the valley hours later, faint but unmistakable. Etienne was gone now, but his legacy inhaled sharply. America was tearing itself in half, and the mills felt the pull. At dawn, the Brandywine awakened not with calm mist, but with agitation. Workers marched faster. Supervisors barked orders with sharper urgency. The river churned harder against its banks, as if aware that the nation's fate would soon ride on its current. There were no battle cries here, but the rhythm of grinding wheels and pounding hammers grew violent in its own way, a mechanical mimicry of the carnage erupting hundreds of miles south. The DuPonts felt the shift immediately. Letters surged in from Washington, from generals, from desperate quartermasters whose supply wagons ran thin. Gunpowder, real gunpowder, the kind that determined who held a field and who was buried beneath it, became the country's lifeblood, and the family, stationed far from any battlefield, now found itself sitting on the heart that pumped it. The mills roared louder. Inside each wooden building, workers moved with a precision sharpened by fear and necessity. Sparks were hunted like enemies. Dust was swept as if it were poison. Every man understood that one mistake could ignite the entire building, and one delay could cost a regiment its survival. The air grew thick with sulfur and sweat. Barrels thudded against carts. Horses strained under the weight of crates marked for Union supply lines. Somewhere far away, soldiers screamed. Here, the mills drowned them out. In the manor, the DuPont heirs gathered around a long table covered in maps and ledgers. Henry DuPont, now the steward of the empire, read casualty reports with the same cold concentration he applied to powder composition. His sons brought news from Washington, not of tactics, but of demand. More powder, better powder, faster powder. The family did not cheer at these requests, but neither did they refuse them. Profit streaked through the smoke like a second sun, rising higher with every shipment that left the Brandywine docks. Trains departed with the weight of entire battles in their cargo, ammunition bound for Antietam, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. Each crate carried the DuPont name into the war, stamped in ink that might as well have been blood. And yet, within the manor walls, silence stretched like a shadow. No matter how polite the letters from Union Command, no matter how official the contracts, a truth pressed itself into the family's consciousness. They were arming a war they would never physically step into. Their boots would not stain with mud or blood. Their sons would not freeze in trenches or collapse beneath musket fire. But their powder, their craft, would shape every victory and every loss. Power had become a double-edged weapon. At night, the mills glowed against the darkness, lanterns swinging in frantic arcs as workers raced to keep up with demand. The river reflected their light like fire scattered across its surface. The air trembled. Every structure, every beam, every powder-filled barrel seemed stretched to its limit. Accidents multiplied. A burst here, a flash there, small fires quickly smothered, near disasters narrowly avoided. But one day, the inevitable came with merciless clarity. A single spark, born from friction too subtle to notice, caught in the air. In less than a breath, a mill exploded, a white-hot bloom tearing upward, devouring wood, earth, and men in a single violent exhale. The shockwave rolled through the valley like a cannonball. Windows shattered, horses reared, workers screamed names into choking smoke. When the flames were extinguished, nothing remained but ash, twisted iron, and grief. The war had slipped through the riverbank and claimed lives without ever sending a soldier. That night, Henry walked the ruins alone. Lantern in hand, he stepped over charred beams and blackened soil, his breath pale in the cold air. The ground still steamed. Powder residue clung to his boots like accusation. He understood now what his father had always feared. To profit from violence is to invite it into your home. But war does not pause for mourning. Even as families buried their dead, new orders flooded in. Urgent, insistent, unrelenting. The Union needed more powder, had to have more, or the war would tilt toward collapse. And in that desperation, the DuPonts found themselves locked to the nation's heartbeat. If they stopped, the North faltered. If they continued, more sons, brothers, and fathers would die with their powder echoing the final moment. No choice was clean, no decision innocent. Still, the mills were rebuilt. Stronger, faster, more efficient. Blast walls rose higher. Water wheels spun harder. Chemists refined formulas that burned hotter and ignited quicker. Union generals praised the results. Newspapers whispered about the powder kings of the Brandywine. And through it all, the DuPonts kept their silence. Across the Atlantic, European observers watched America's civil fracture with morbid fascination. Some placed wagers on outcomes. Others speculated on the war's economic ripple. But a few industrialists, watching the meteoric rise of DuPont influence, recognized something else. A new class of merchant was emerging, one who supplied war instead of fighting it. A merchant of power, a merchant of fire. And in that identity lay both triumph and ruin. As the war dragged on, the DuPont name became inseparable from the Union war machine. Their powder fed victory after victory, and their wealth grew so rapidly it began to feel like something alive, pulsing, expanding, hungering. Yet in the manor's quiet hours, when the workers slept and the river murmured against its stones, Henry DuPont sometimes stood at his window and asked a question the ledgers could not answer. How many lives rode inside each crate they shipped? The war would end. The shipments would slow. But the shadow of this era, the choices made, the fortunes earned, the dead unknowingly tied to their craft, would cling to the DuPont dynasty like the residue of black powder on human skin. And the family, though untouched by battle, would forever carry the weight of a war they helped fight from afar, a war that found its merchant. The 20th century rose over the Brandywine not like a sunrise, but like a locomotive. Iron wheels screaming, steam curling into the sky, the world reshaping itself with noise and speed. Rails cut across America like veins, carrying coal, ore, men, and the frantic promise of new wealth. Cities swelled, factories roared. And into that hunger for progress stepped a dynasty already forged from danger, the DuPonts. The mills that once exhaled powder now shared the landscape with laboratories and workshops, buildings of brick and glass that hummed with experiments. Smoke still clung to the valley, but now it carried unfamiliar scents. Nitrates, acids, dyes that turned water strange colors before draining back into the river. Where Etienne once whispered formulas to a handful of apprentices, dozens of chemists now scribbled in journals, their hands stained with the pigments and poisons of modern science. A new empire was forming, one not limited to the roar of gunpowder. Fertilizers promised to coax life from stubborn soil. Dyes brought color to factories and fashion houses. Strange new materials, early plastics, solvents, compounds without names, hinted at a future built on chemistry rather than land or steel. The DuPonts did not merely watch this tide rise, they rode it. Henry's sons and nephews stepped into positions like chess pieces arranged for a long, calculated game. Some oversaw industrial plants powered by river and coal. Others traveled to Europe to poach scientific techniques. A few stalked the halls of Washington, building relationships that looked like friendships but felt more like negotiations. Each move strengthened the dynasty's reach. But with expansion came something subtler, more dangerous. Ambition no longer aimed outward, but inward. Boardrooms filled with heirs whose smiles hid sharpened intent. Tables once used for family discussions now echoed with competing visions. Some wanted deeper industrial dominion, more factories, more chemicals, more patents. Others sought elegance and influence, pushing the family toward philanthropy, politics, and social esteem. Their disagreements were polite in public, venomous in private. The manor that once felt unified under Etienne's steady presence now trembled with invisible fissures. Every morning, the boardroom's long windows caught the rising sun and cast harsh light on the men gathered around polished oak. The grandsons of the founder, cousins bound by blood but divided by ambition. Papers rustled like wings of restless birds. Contracts lay stacked like ammunition. Metal pens clicked with the impatience of men who believed themselves indispensable. The empire was no longer a creature of riverbanks and rolling mills. It had become something bigger, colder, hungrier. In the factories, machines roared with mechanical frenzy, chewing through raw materials, spitting out inventions that would reshape daily life. Workers moved through hallways that smelled of sulfur, ammonia, and the metallic tang of new compounds. Ventilation fans whirred like distant storms. The river no longer ran clear. It reflected streaks of industrial color, blues, reds, purples, as if recording every experiment in its currents. But it was in the laboratories that the next era of the dynasty truly formed. Rows of long benches glowed beneath gas lamps. Glassware glinted like fragile treasure. Beakers simmered with liquids that fumed, hissed, or glowed faintly in the dark. Chemists peered into reactions with an intensity priests once reserved for sacred texts. And somewhere, in a forgotten notebook or mislabeled flask, the seeds of future triumphs and future scandals already pulsed. Innovation became the family's new form of ambition and its new battlefield. The DuPont name began appearing not just in military contracts, but in agricultural pamphlets, scientific journals, textile mills. Their fertilizers enriched farmlands from Pennsylvania to the Great Plains. Their dyes bled into the uniforms of armies and the dresses of debutantes. Their synthetic materials found their way into homes, factories, and laboratories, each invention bringing fortune and responsibility in equal measure. Expansion gave the dynasty power, but power sharpened old rivalries into quiet blades. Cousin watched cousin, brother measured brother. Arguments flickered behind closed doors like sparks waiting for oxygen. One faction argued that the company should spread further, new plants, new states, new nations. Another warned that overreach invited disaster.
Their debates grew sharper as profits soared. They fought not with fists, but with numbers, projections, and the subtle art of persuasion. Sometimes, at the end of long meetings, a chill settled through the boardroom, the kind that told each man he had stepped 1 inch closer to becoming either a king or an obstacle. Whispers spread through the corridors. Who deserved to lead? Who had the founder's vision? Who merely sought power for its reflection? The machines outside did not care. They continued their metallic symphony, pounding rhythm into the valley. But inside the manor, the true engines of conflict were human, fueled by pride, fear, legacy. As the century accelerated, the DuPont empire stretched its limbs wider. New factories sprouted like iron fortresses. Patents accumulated like treasure beneath the family crest. Rail lines connected their products to every corner of the country. Progress became the dynasty's heartbeat. Yet beneath this relentless march, something darker stirred. A tension coiled in the walls, in the minutes before board meetings, in the glances exchanged across dinner tables. The older generation clung to memory, the younger clung to ambition, and between them lay the fragile thread of legacy, pulled taut by competing hands. Sometimes, late at night, when the last train howled across the valley and the laboratories dimmed, the manor returned to silence, and in that silence, one could almost feel the fracture lines beneath the floors, thin, hair-like, invisible to the eye, but spreading slowly outward with every decision made, every secret kept, every ambition unleashed. For the DuPonts were no longer just merchants of powder or patrons of science. They had become architects of a new industrial age, an empire of chemicals, minds, and will. And empires built on innovation do not crumble from outside forces first. They fracture from within. Somewhere deep in the manor, in a locked drawer, in a guarded ledger, in the quiet envy between two brothers, the first spark of that fracture glowed faintly, a whisper waiting to become fire. The manor had weathered storms before, river floods, economic tremors, distant wars, but the quiet tension that settled inside its walls in the early 20th century felt different. It was not thunderous. It did not rattle windows or shake the ground. It whispered. It drifted. It seeped beneath doorframes and into the very grain of the oak floors. A stillness, thick and calculated, like two predators circling in tall grass. The DuPont heirs had grown into men of influence, polished, practiced, each carrying the family name like a blade tucked beneath velvet cloth. They had inherited success, but also expectation, the command of a sprawling industrial empire whose reach stretched from gunpowder to chemicals to new materials still unnamed. But empires, even family ones, do not share thrones easily. In boardrooms lined with portraits of stern ancestors, cousins and brothers gathered in tailored suits, offering each other courteous smiles that never reached their eyes. Meetings began with pleasantries, inquiries about health, children, travels, but beneath the mild chatter flowed the current of ambition, pulled tight and invisible. Ledgers lay open on the table like maps of battlegrounds. Profit lines surged and dipped like cavalry charges. Department reports became ammunition. Patents were treated like captured territory. And every decision, no matter how small, carried the question everyone avoided asking aloud. Who will control the dynasty next? In public, the heirs stood united. In private, the war had already begun. Henry Francis DuPont, with his calm voice and calculating gaze, preferred subtle influence over confrontation. His power lay in relationships: senators, bankers, museum directors, social elites. He understood how to make decisions appear inevitable.
His cousins, on the other hand, feuding branches descending from earlier sons and nephews, favored direct control over profit and production. They believed leadership belonged not to the most diplomatic, but to the most ruthless. The divide deepened with each quarter's report. Board meetings stretched late into the night, the air growing heavy with unspoken arguments. When one heir proposed expanding chemical plants into the Midwest, another countered with warnings of risk and cost. When one advocated for dominance in synthetic fibers, another pushed for more conservative investment. Every viewpoint held merit, every voice believed itself right. And behind every disagreement lay a sliver of fear that choosing wrong would topple a legacy. The younger generation watched from the edges of those meetings, absorbing every shift in tone, every tightened jaw. They learned that power was not simply inherited, it was maneuvered, protected, stolen. The family creed had once been science and discipline. Now it expanded to include strategy and psychological warfare. Rumors drifted through the halls like drafts. A cousin privately lobbying shareholders. A brother meeting with an executive behind closed doors. A suspiciously timed leak of financial data. A minor scandal quietly buried before newspapers could sniff it out. Sabotage, subtle and deniable, threaded itself through the family's interactions. A misplaced document, a retracted promise, a vote delayed until one rival fell ill. Politics, once outside the manor's concern, now ruled its inner rooms. The patriarchs tried to keep a united front, but unity requires trust, and trust is the first casualty of ambition. Even the river outside seemed to sense the shift. Its once steady murmur grew harsher as industrial runoff stained its currents. Factories expanded at its banks, chimneys releasing smoke that drifted across the estate. The empire was growing, yes, but it was also tilting, heavy with the weight of internal strife. Inside the great library, where Etienne had once taught chemistry, the new heirs gathered among the shelves with a different purpose. They reviewed contracts, whispered about leadership votes, calculated alliances. The smell of musty books mingled with ink and tension. One evening, as winter gnawed at the windows, two cousins stood across the long table from each other, Alfred and Pierre, their reflections wavering in the polished wood. They spoke calmly, as always. They debated numbers, as always. They maintained decorum, as always. But beneath their conversation burned a rivalry that would split the company into factions. Alfred's vision stretched toward innovation and industrial dominance. Pierre craved stability and consolidation. Both believed themselves the rightful heir to the legacy. Neither would yield. Their conflict remained hidden from public eye. No shouting, no accusations, only strategic moves executed with surgical precision. Employees sensed tension but could not name its source. Executives maneuvered carefully, afraid to align too openly with one side or the other. The entire empire held its breath. Then came the vote that would determine control of the company's future. Shareholders gathered in a room heavy with anticipation. Papers rustled like restless spirits. The air pressed down as if history itself were leaning in to listen. When the ballots were counted, Alfred emerged victorious by the narrowest of margins. Pierre's face remained calm, but a flicker in his eyes betrayed the fracture deepening between them. The dynasty had chosen a leader, but the cost was unity. Power, once shared, now flowed unevenly. Those aligned with Alfred advanced quickly. Those aligned with Pierre found themselves sidelined or gently pushed toward retirement. Some left the company entirely, their departure cloaked in polite letters but steeped in resentment. The heirs' quiet war did not explode in a single moment. It spread slowly, quietly, like a crack beneath a foundation, invisible until the structure above began to shift. Yet the greatest danger was not that the family fought each other. It was that while their eyes were locked inward, the world around them continued to evolve. New industries rose, competitors sharpened their teeth, politicians eyed corporate giants with suspicion. Chemicals that once seemed miraculous revealed darker sides. And in corner offices and corporate halls, whispers grew louder. Was the DuPont dynasty prepared for the storms coming their way? But for now, the family's gaze remained fixed on its own internal battlefield, a war fought not with cannons or rifles, but with inheritance, influence, and silence. A war where victory was hollow and defeat was permanent. A war that no dynasty, no matter how wealthy or brilliant, could win without losing something essential. And as night fell over the Brandywine, settling across the old manor and the glowing factories, one truth lingered in the quiet. The greatest threat to the empire was no longer outside the gates. It was already seated at the family table. The laboratories rose where the old powder mills once stood, brick temples of glass and light, humming with possibility. The river still murmured, but its voice was drowned beneath the hiss of burners, the rattle of glassware, the steady heartbeat of machines that mixed, heated, stretched, and cooled substances no one had ever seen before. If Etienne's age had belonged to the alchemy of danger, this new century belonged to the alchemy of creation. Science had become the dynasty's new throne. Inside these laboratories, men in white coats moved like priests conducting rituals, their hands steady over beakers glowing with color.
The air carried the tang of solvents, acids, and an undercurrent of something that felt electric. On the benches lay possibilities waiting to be born, powders, liquids, fibers suspended like captured lightning. Here, the DuPont empire found its new identity, a kingdom of molecules. Wallace Carothers, the quiet, haunted genius at the center of it all, drifted through the labs like a shadowed prophet. His eyes saw beyond the materials in front of him, into the world they could create. Friends said he carried storms beneath his calm exterior. Colleagues claimed he possessed the rare gift of seeing the invisible architecture of chemistry. The DuPonts recognized that genius immediately. They funded him, protected him, and built a new empire around the ideas he chased. Late at night, when most of the staff had gone home, his light still burned in the window. Papers littered his desk like fallen leaves. Strange polymers stretched between clamps and hooks, glistening under lamp glow, ribbons of solidified dream. He recorded his failures with the precision of a surgeon, his breakthroughs with the humility of a man who suspected the world would not understand the true cost of what he was creating. Then, one morning in 1935, a new thread was drawn between steel rollers, thin, strong, impossibly smooth, nylon. It shimmered like spun glass, yet held the strength of metal. In women's stockings, it clung with elegance. In military gear, it resisted weather and wear. In industry, it replaced silk, cotton, and steel with something lighter, cheaper, and endlessly adaptable. Factories roared to life. Commerce surged. DuPont executives saw in that single strand a future woven entirely from synthetics, a world shaped not by nature, but by invention. Wealth rose like a tide. Synthetic fibers flowed into markets. Agricultural chemicals spread across fields. Plastics seeped into kitchens and hospitals. DuPont stock soared. And in the boardrooms, the heirs watched their profits stack in layers, thin, slick, indestructible, just like the materials they now commanded. But nylon was not the only miracle forming in the DuPont cauldron. During wartime research, a strange, slippery substance emerged, a polymer so resistant to heat, chemicals, and reaction that it seemed to defy the laws Carothers himself had tried to obey. It felt smooth, almost oily, but left no residue. Nothing stuck to it, nothing affected it. It became a ghost among materials, invisible, untouchable, indestructible. Teflon. The scientists filed it away as another invention, unaware they had birthed both marvel and omen.
Beyond the laboratory walls, the world clamored for innovation. Inside the labs, fumes curled toward vents, carrying warnings too faint to hear. DuPont celebrated the new age with the pride of an empire reborn. Advertisements painted a future glowing with convenience, fibers that never tore, coatings that never stained, products that never failed. Housewives smiled in magazines holding pans that shed eggs like water. Farmers spread fertilizers that promised richer soil. Soldiers marched with gear strengthened by polymers tougher than steel. Science had given the family what gunpowder never could, a grip on everyday life. Yet for every miracle DuPont unveiled, a shadow followed close behind. Chemists noticed strange irritations on their skin. A few reported headaches lingering long after shifts. Birds perched on factory rooftops sometimes fell in silent arcs. Wastewater shimmered with unnatural colors before sinking into the river. But production targets left little room for hesitation, and the thrill of discovery overshadowed caution. In quiet corners, questions formed. What happened to these new compounds once they left the laboratory? How long would they linger in soil, water, blood? What price did indestructible carry? But those questions drifted like fumes, present but ungrasped. Meanwhile, the boardroom echoed with new power. Young heirs pored over chemical patents like battlefield maps. Engineers spoke in the language of molecules. Profits no longer depended on war, but on the very fabric of daily existence. The empire had evolved from a merchant of powder into a titan of chemistry, its influence woven through homes, farms, armies, and dreams. Yet behind the polished confidence, unrest simmered. Wallace Carothers, the man who had birthed nylon, felt the weight of his genius like a millstone. Depression consumed him, a darkness deeper than any laboratory shadow. He questioned whether the synthetic world he had created was a gift or a curse, whether mankind was meant to hold such tools, such transformations. His suicide in 1937 left a hollow silence in the laboratories, a warning unspoken but deeply felt. Even the river seemed changed, its currents duller, its edges stained with the runoff of invention. The Brandywine had once carried the scent of gunpowder, now it carried chemical ghosts. But to the Dynasty, the new age meant triumph. Nylon replaced silk in parachutes during World War II, saving thousands of soldiers. Teflon lined machinery in the Manhattan Project, surviving forces that melted metal. DuPont stood at the center of progress, desired, needed, indispensable. And yet, beneath every breakthrough, beneath every gleaming advertisement, beneath every polished boardroom table, a shadow thickened. A cost whispered in fumes. A trade written in molecules no one fully understood. An empire rising on materials that would outlive their creators, their children, and their century. Science had become the new throne, but every throne casts a long, dark shadow. And somewhere within the laboratories, under the flicker of fluorescent lights and the hum of exhaust fans, that shadow deepened, layer by layer, like something indestructible. War rose again, not as a single explosion, but as a distant rumble, an old monster turning in its sleep. Europe trembled first, borders buckled, flags sharpened like blades. And across the Atlantic, the Brandywine Valley felt the vibration long before America entered the conflict. It hummed in the rafters of chemical plants, rattled in glass beakers, crept into the ledgers of executives who had learned generations ago that danger in the world meant opportunity at home. DuPont had become an empire of invention. Now it would become a furnace. When the First World War swallowed Europe in fire, governments reached for the only thing that could decide the length of battles: explosives,
chemicals, synthetic materials that bent physics and fate. Factories that had once produced dyes and fertilizers shifted overnight into engines of war. Nitrates surged, smokeless powder rolled out in endless streams, dynamite returned to its throne. Chimneys belched flame into the evening sky, turning the horizon a bruised orange. Railcars clattered like teeth. Workers labored in shifts that devoured sleep and year. The valley glowed through the night, endless, relentless, unstoppable. In Washington, DuPont executives sat at polished tables beside cabinet members and generals. They did not speak as merchants, they spoke as partners in strategy. Government contracts flowed like river water, thick, unstoppable, binding. The company became responsible for the lion's share of America's explosives. At the war's peak, the DuPont empire supplied nearly half of all powder used by Allied armies. Every shell fired in France carried a whisper from Delaware. Every trench shattered, every railway bombed, every artillery barrage that shook the earth bore the fingerprints of a family that had never seen the Western Front. And the profits rose accordingly. Wealth surged through the company like electrical current. New laboratories opened, new plants erupted across states. Every month brought more contracts, more urgency, more invention. The heirs could feel the empire stretching, expanding, pulsing with power. It was intoxicating, terrifying, impossible to ignore. But success always leaves a shadow. Whispers spread among workers who saw their friends maimed by chemical exposure, their lungs burned by fumes. Accidents multiplied under wartime pressure. A single miscalculation sent entire facilities into the sky. Building walls flattened, earth cratered, lives ended without warning. Mourning families understood the cruel truth: war did not need to reach their homeland to take them. But the world had no time for grief. The war machine marched on. When the armistice finally came, DuPont emerged not weakened, but transformed. The company's fortunes towered over pre-war levels. With new wealth came new influence. With new influence came new expectations. The Dynasty had become something more than an industrial family. It had become a pillar of national strength. But peace rarely lasts long in the halls of power. Barely 2 decades later, another rumble rolled across continents. A dictator rose in Germany. Nations bristled like forests of spears. And once again, the world marched toward fire. This time, DuPont did not wait for the vibration to reach their doorstep. They saw the storm coming years before the first gunshot. Laboratories accelerated research. Engineers refined polymers and coatings. Production plants modernized, expanded, multiplied. When war finally erupted, sweeping across Europe, then Asia, then the world, DuPont was already prepared. Factories lit up like constellations. Night shifts blurred into day. Synthetic materials, nylon for parachutes, resins for aircraft, coatings for machinery, flowed like blood through the veins of war. Teflon, once a curiosity, found a secret purpose in the Manhattan Project, lining equipment that handled forces beyond comprehension. Behind barbed wire and guarded doors, scientists used DuPont materials to shape the device that would end one war and fracture the future. The Dynasty never stepped onto the battlefield, but their shadows stretched across every front. Every plane, every tank, every bomb, every chemical mask, every parachute that snapped open above enemy fire. The United States government recognized the company's value with gratitude wrapped in caution. DuPont had become too necessary, too powerful, too deeply woven into the bones of modern warfare. Their contracts no longer felt like agreements. They felt like tethering ropes tying the Dynasty to the nation's victories, its defeats, its guilt. The heirs understood this bind intimately. In private meetings, they debated the ethics of their position. Some claimed they were simply supplying a nation fighting for survival. Others wondered what it meant to build fortunes from destruction. Still others dismissed the question entirely. The world, they argued, would demand these materials from someone, better the DuPonts than their competitors. But late at night, when the factories finally dimmed and the river glimmered with the reflections of distant gunfire, the truth felt heavier. Indispensability is a chain. The empire could not retreat from war, not without collapsing the structure it had built, not without betraying alliances formed over decades, not without risking the wrath of a nation that now depended on them. So the DuPonts pushed forward. When the Second World War ended, the family once again stood at the height of influence. Their materials had shaped the weapons that ended empires, liberated nations, and scarred the earth. Their technologies were woven into the very fabric of post-war America: homes, industries, infrastructure. Victory had been achieved. But the triumph carried a question that lingered like smoke. What does it cost to be indispensable? To be needed by nations in their darkest hours? To create the tools that protect and destroy in the same breath? To rise with every conflict and grow with every catastrophe? The heir who stared longest at the question was the one who understood its weight best. Power built on war can never truly rest. And somewhere beyond the Brandywine, in the silence after surrender, the empire listened to the question echoing through its foundations, a question that would only grow louder with time. The Brandywine no longer ruled the DuPont empire. Its riverbanks, once blackened by gunpowder and echoing with the rhythm of grinding wheels, now sat quiet, historic but irrelevant. Power had moved elsewhere. It had climbed into the sky. Corporate towers rose like crystalline obelisks in Wilmington, their glass faces reflecting the sun with a confidence only dynasties could afford. Men and women entered through revolving doors, carrying briefcases instead of shovels, formulas instead of gunpowder barrels. The DuPont crest, once embossed on crates of explosives, now glimmered above boardrooms where billions were spoken of with casual ease. It was a new throne, a chemical crown. Inside, the air smelled of carpet glue and ambition, not sulfur. Executives shook hands across lacquered tables. Lawyers in immaculate suits whispered clauses like coded spells. Laboratories streamed data instead of smoke, and every level of the tower pulsed with the same belief. The world had entered the age of synthetics, and DuPont held the scepter. From the glow of kitchen stoves to the armor of tanks, from milk cartons to moon missions, the company's inventions threaded themselves through civilization. Nylon, Teflon, Freon, Kevlar, names that sounded almost mythic, woven into modern life as intimately as breath. Housewives praised the ease of non-stick cookware. Pilots trusted cockpit components that did not melt. Farmers spread chemical fertilizer across fields wide enough to swallow the horizon. The company's influence rippled across continents like a technicolor tide. Profits no longer rose, they soared. Stock prices curled upward like smoke from a ritual fire. Dividends fell into heirs' hands like annual snowfall. In the tower's upper floors, executives toasted expansions and acquisitions as if celebrating coronations. But every crown grows heavy, and every empire, no matter how polished, casts a shadow. The first hints came quietly, buried in memos, whispered in labs, dismissed in meetings. A chemist noted unusual toxicity in a compound. A worker's blood work came back with anomalies. A report warned that certain chemicals refused to break down in soil or water. But such concerns, executives argued, were premature, inconclusive, under investigation. Shareholders disliked hesitation. The market despised doubt, and the board had numbers to protect. The world demanded convenience, and DuPont delivered it in gleaming, indestructible layers. Plastic wraps that sealed freshness, coatings that repelled stains, foams that cushioned, stiffened, insulated, preserved. Progress marched on synthetic legs. Every product promised a future cleaner, easier, cheaper. No one asked what happened after the convenience ran its course. Not yet. Still, unease gathered in the quiet places, on factory floors where workers coughed harder than usual, in neighborhoods where strange ailments clustered near plants, in rivers where fish drifted belly up beneath water that shimmered unnaturally. And behind the mirrored walls of the corporate tower, some employees grew nervous. Interns whispered, scientists hesitated, managers drafted reports no one wanted to read. But above them all, the executives continued their ascent, confident the fortress they built could withstand anything. They had survived wars, depressions, industry revolutions. They were titans. Their influence was historical, structural, indispensable. Yet outside the towers, the wind began to change. Lawsuits appeared like dark clouds on the horizon, single drops of rain that hinted at storms. A farmer blamed chemical runoff for deforming his livestock. A factory worker claimed the fumes caused illnesses. A neighboring town found its water supply tainted with compounds no one could pronounce. And the defendants in each case bore the same name, Pont. Public curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Suspicion thickened into scrutiny. Scrutiny bloomed into outrage. What had once been praised as miraculous now carried a question too large to ignore. What happens when the materials that improved life are impossible to destroy? Inside the tower, emergency meetings multiplied. Lawyers filled boardrooms. Scientists re-examined old formulas with shaking hands. Executives spoke in clipped tones, discussing liability, mitigation, containment. But something deeper trembled beneath their strategy. The realization that the empire had outgrown its ability to control the consequences of its own creations. Synthetic power had blanketed the world, but it had also seeded it with problems that did not die, did not fade, did not apologize. The chemical crown glowed bright, but it radiated heat. And as lawsuits stacked like storm clouds gathering mass, the veneer of invincibility began to crack. Investigations dug through decades of documents. Environmental groups circled like wolves. Government agencies demanded answers. Whistleblowers stepped forward with stories long buried under confidentiality agreements. The tower of glass still shone in the sunlight, but inside, the Dynasty felt the floor tilt. Power, once so solid, now seemed brittle. Legacy, once so polished, now felt stained. The DuPont heirs, those who once fought bitterly for control, found themselves staring at a new, unfamiliar enemy. Not a rival company, not a foreign industry, not a war, but the weight of their own century of innovation. The consequences of materials that outlived their creators. The haunting question of whether the empire had crossed a line without realizing it. Late at night, when the workers left and the tower quieted, the fluorescent lights hummed like distant thunder. Files lay open on desks. Coffee cups cooled beside maps of contaminated land. And on the top floors, a few executives sat in dark offices, staring at the skyline, wondering how a dynasty built on progress had become a monument trembling under its own brilliance. The chemical crown gleamed still, but the shadow beneath it stretched wider each year. And somewhere in the gathering storm, a truth pressed tighter around the empire. The higher the dynasty climbed, the more clearly it heard the sound of cracking glass. It began with something invisible. Not a boom like the old powder mills, not a chemical fire lighting up the valley, not even the metallic tang of solvents drifting from factory vents. No, this threat moved quieter than all of them. It slipped through pipes, into soil, beneath fingernails, into bloodstream and breath. A ghost with no shape, no color, no scent.
a chemical that did not die. In the late hours of the night, under fluorescent lights humming like nervous insects, DuPont chemists once studied it with pride. A marvel of resistance. A polymer that nothing could stain, nothing could melt, nothing could challenge. It coated machines in the Manhattan Project. It lined cookware in millions of kitchens. It wrapped the world in a second skin of smooth, indestructible convenience. They called it C8. The world called it Teflon. But the river called it something else. A trespasser. The factories along the Ohio and West Virginia borders exhaled this ghost into water and air. Waste seeped into fields. Barrels buried decades earlier rusted open like old wounds. The chemical seeped into wells, into cattle, into milk. And slowly, so slowly, no one noticed at first, it seeped into people. A farmer named Wilbur Tennant was among the first to understand. He watched his cattle die with eyes clouded white, organs blackened, bodies twisted by something unseen. He filmed the horror himself, the staggering, the frothing, the collapse, and carried the tapes like an accusation in his calloused hands. He begged regulators to listen. He pleaded with the company whose trucks he saw rumbling past his fields. But the executives met his distress with polished smiles and careful deflection. They reassured. They redirected. They removed documents. Behind boardroom doors, lawyers slid memos across tables, marked confidential, stamped urgent, filed away. Reports from company scientists revealed alarming truths. The chemical did not break down in nature. It accumulated in blood. It passed through generations. It lived longer than the people who made it. But none of this reached the public. Not yet. In the glass tower, executives debated strategy like generals preparing for siege. They spoke of liability, not consequences, of mitigation, not harm. They weighed public outrage against profit, and the ledger judged the human cost acceptable. For decades, the empire's skin had been coated in the sheen of innovation. They would not let one chemical strip it away. But the ghost was already loose. Blood samples from workers showed levels hundreds of times higher than the general population. Wastewater downstream glowed faintly under certain lights. Children developed strange illnesses. Mothers miscarried without explanation. A community began to map its tragedies and saw a cluster they could no longer ignore. The lawsuits rose like smoke signals. First one, then a dozen, then an avalanche. Each accusation carried a name attached to suffering: a farmer whose land had turned toxic, a worker whose teeth crumbled, a child whose body had been touched by a substance no one could see but everyone could feel. In courtrooms, DuPont attorneys countered with precision, denying causation, questioning science, attacking credibility. But the truth had a way of leaking, just like the chemical. Internal documents emerged through whistleblowers and subpoenas, memos admitting C8's dangers, animal studies showing tumors, warnings ignored for decades. Each page landed like a hammer blow, splintering the facade the Dynasty had built. Families packed court galleries, clutching photo albums like shields. Workers testified with trembling hands. Scientists, once loyal to the Dynasty, now spoke under oath about the conflict between discovery and denial. The courtroom air felt thick, charged with decades of silence breaking. And the DuPont heirs, the once unshakable pillars of American industry, suddenly felt history tilting beneath them. Executives pivoted to damage control. Public relations teams crafted apologies wrapped in caution. Settlements flowed, millions upon millions, like a river trying to wash a stain that could not be washed. But money, for all its power, could not silence the truth now rising from the ground. Communities ran blood tests.
Cities mapped contamination plumes. Scientists traced the chemical across oceans. Journalists uncovered its presence in animals, glaciers, even rain. The ghost had gone global. For the first time in centuries, the dynasty's greatest threat was not competition, government scrutiny, or internal rivalries. It was consequence. The empire had once engineered victory for nations. Now it was facing a reckoning engineered by its own inventions. The Teflon miracle had become a Teflon curse, a stain that no boardroom, no contract, no dynasty could scrub away.
In quiet moments, far from microphones and subpoenas, some heirs stared at their own hands, wondering what legacy meant when it came coated in harm. They had inherited a kingdom of synthetics, one built on brilliance, ambition, and risk. But somewhere along the line, the alchemy had turned on them. What was meant to protect became a poison. What was meant to endure became an accusation. And still, the chemical drifted. Through water, through soil, through veins. A ghost without a grave. The dynasty stood in the middle of the storm, battered by truths they had long outrun, staring at a future where their inventions lived on in the very bodies of those they claimed to serve. And as the lawsuits mounted and the world pointed its finger at the Titan, one truth settled over the empire with the weight of prophecy. This was a reckoning they could not engineer away.
By the time the 21st century arrived, the DuPont empire no longer resembled the forge Etienne built on the banks of the Brandywine. It no longer resembled the chemical citadel that dominated the skies of Wilmington. It no longer even resembled the dynasty that once battled itself in polished boardrooms. It had become something unbound, a force without a single face, a legacy without a single throne, an empire that survived by shedding its own skin. Mergers reshaped its bones. Spin-offs scattered its identity. Nameplates were replaced on glass towers. Departments that once fed entire nations were sold, traded, or fused into conglomerates whose initials carried more weight than any family crest. Dow DuPont, Corteva, Chemours. Each transformation arrived like an earthquake, quiet at first, then world-changing, rattling the halls where portraits of the founders once hung. Entire divisions were carved away like limbs removed to save a body. Others were merged in corporate alchemy so intricate that even seasoned analysts struggled to trace the lineage. And through it all, the DuPont heirs watched the dynasty splinter into shapes they could not fully claim as their own. The fortune survived. Of course it did. Wealth of that magnitude rarely dies. It simply migrates into trusts, foundations, private ventures, new empires rising from the residue of the old. But the dynasty scattered like powder on wind. Some heirs retreated into philanthropy, shaping museums, libraries, gardens, quiet sanctuaries far from the echo of chemical drums. Others pursued politics, business, or anonymity. A few vanished into private estates, where the family name hung on the gates like a relic of a vanished kingdom. No patriarch emerged, no unified vision survived. The empire had become too large for family hands, too widespread for family allegiance. It moved through markets instead of bloodlines. It answered to shareholders, not patriarchs, not succession. Yet even as the dynasty fragmented, its creations remained, woven through the modern world with a permanence that felt almost mythic. Nylon in military gear, in ropes, in instruments. Teflon in kitchens, factories, satellites. Kevlar in vests that stop bullets, and in gloves that hold steady in surgical theaters. Fertilizers feeding billions. Chemicals in circuits, screens, coatings, cables. Compounds with half-lives older than the people who produced them. The empire no longer needed the DuPonts. Its inventions had outlived them. Still, the shadows remained. Court cases continued long after the mergers, long after the dynasty splintered. Communities still tested their wells. Scientists still traced chemicals in bloodstreams across the globe. Executives in successor companies still navigated the fallout of decisions made decades before. A new generation of attorneys and advocates rose to challenge the very materials that once revolutionized the world. The empire had fragmented, but its ghosts remained whole. And occasionally, in the quiet corners of interviews or memoirs, an heir would admit what history had already begun to understand, that the dynasty had become both architect and prisoner of its own creations. The power that once elevated their name now lived separately from it, in products that could not be recalled, in technologies impossible to untangle from daily life. Progress and consequence braided together like threads in a rope, indestructible, inseparable, unending. In Wilmington, the old tower still stood, though its nameplate had changed. Workers passed through the lobby without glancing at the marble floors, unaware of the centuries of ambition etched into the walls. Outside, the river continued its slow march to the sea, carrying with it fragments of a legacy too vast to measure. And somewhere deep in the archives, sealed in folders and tablets of brittle paper, the story of the DuPonts rested, pages heavy with triumph, tragedy, invention, ambition, and the quiet truth that all empires eventually escape the hands that built them. For in the end, this was the shadow the dynasty could never outrun. They had built a world with their own chemistry, a world that no longer needed them, a world that would long outlive them, a world shaped by materials that had become immortal while their makers remained painfully mortal. Fortunes can be transferred, companies can be sold, names can fade from skylines, but the inventions remain. And as the 21st century deepened, as nations rose and fell, as new industries emerged from digital flame, the question lingered over the remnants of the dynasty like smoke over a quiet battlefield. What happens when an empire outlives its kings? History's answer whispered through the world the DuPonts left behind. It becomes unbound.